All right. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still somewhat on hold, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster, Season 4, Intriguing Interviews with Creative Minds. I can't believe it's here, but tonight is my final show of the summer. So to end on a great note, with us tonight is Alex Segura. Alex is the best-selling author of the Star Wars novel Poe Dameron Freefall, the Pete Fernandez mystery series, and Secret Identity. He has also written a number of comic books, most notably the superhero noir Black Ghost and the YA music series The Archies. He is also the co-creator, co-writer of the Lethal Lit Crime YA podcast from iHeartRadio, which was named one of the best podcasts of 2015 by the New York Times. And by day, he is the SVP of Sales and Marketing at Oni Press. Welcome, Alex.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. So just a heads up to the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you have for me or Alex in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. Okay, so as we always do, we'll start at the beginning. Alex, where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
Born and raised in Miami, Florida. My parents are Cuban. They came over when they were children, and I was born there.
All right, wow. So what was it like growing up in Miami? That's a very different, it's different culture than up here in the Northeast.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know winter until I was in my 20s. I'd never seen snow. I mean, we didn't travel a lot when I was a kid. So it's just one season, basically. That's the most obvious thing that's different from now I live in New York. So it's very, it took a little adapting, but I've been in New York since 2006. So yeah, I split my time. I go down to Miami pretty regularly when we're not in a global pandemic. But yeah, I grew up, raised, in the Cuban culture, and, a lot of, speak Spanish, spoke English, and it was a lot of, it's very different from New York. The weather's the most obvious difference, I guess.
So are you first generation born American?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So was it just you? Do you have brothers? You have sisters?
I have a younger sister. Yeah.
Younger sister. So this was what? So let's go back, so you're a kid, you're growing up in Miami. So I'm assuming that because it has a large, Spanish speaking population, and certainly large Cuban culture. So what was that like, kind of that fusion of, the Cuban culture intersecting with, traditional American culture, for whatever that's worth?
The Cuban community in Miami and South Florida is very prevalent. It's very strong. It's very strong. I wouldn't even, I think in Miami, it's a very strong group in terms of political pull and just like presence. Like, I wouldn't even feel like it's saying it's a minority. Like, there was just the Cuban community in Miami so prevalent. So it really didn't feel like we were just mixing with American culture. It just felt like that was the culture, like Cuban American culture, like a blend.
So were you in Miami proper, or sort of on the outskirts? Like, where were you exactly?
Miami is pretty spread out. So Miami, the city itself, is not that large, kind of in the same way like you have New York City. Well, not really the same way. There's like a cluster downtown Miami, and then everything else is kind of spread out into the suburbs. So I was in the suburbs, like in West Kendall.
So it's certainly I'm actually in the real estate business, so it's my business to know kind of like how the structures change and whatnot. And certainly I've been going down there pretty consistently for the last 20 years. And Miami certainly has changed quite a bit over the last 20, 30 years.
Right.
What's that been like to watch from someone who hails from there?
It's been interesting, lots of gentrification, lots of, like real estate driven rebranding of neighborhoods. Like, in the first Pete Fernandez book, he lives in an area called Little Haiti. That's now called the Design District. Stuff just getting redesigned and repackaged, and a lot more development spreading out. Whereas before there would be long stretches of unincorporated land, and now you're seeing that just becoming condos or townhouses, and just the spread is continuing.
So your parents coming from Cuba, did they have any issues coming to the U.S.? Castro obviously had a pretty tight hold on the government back there. Was it easy to come over? Was it a problem?
It wasn't easy. I mean, my mom had to come over early. She came over as one of the Peter Pan kids, which was a program that would fly kids from Cuba to Miami to stay with relatives while their parents tried to figure out how to get off the island. And so she spent a year at her aunt's house, before my grandparents could rejoin her. So that was a pretty intense experience for her.
Wow.
And I don't think my dad didn't have that same problem. I think he came over with his parents. But it was in the early days of Castro's takeover. And I think a lot of it was, people forget that there was a level of uncertainty when he was fighting in the mountains against Batista, and Batista was not beloved in Cuba. But there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether he was a communist, what his political leanings were, and how things were going to shake down. But once he took power and kind of said, "This is who I am," that's when people really started to leave.
So when your mom came over, how old was she?
Probably 8 or 9.
Wow. So she was 8 or 9, comes over as a young kid, and then stays with relatives for a year, and then her folks joined. Did your mom ever talk about like what that was like, being separated from her?
Oh
From
yeah,
your,
it was
your
intense. It was
grandparents?
hard. Yeah, it was hard. And as a kid, you don't understand. And it's not like today where we have the internet and FaceTime and Zoom meetings and ways to stay in touch in real time. So a lot of it was like phone calls and letters and wherever possible. So it was extremely difficult.
Wow. Did she talk about, did it have a lasting effect on her as she, became an adult from that experience, or was she able to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a way it can't. I mean, it's
Right.
just a gap of time that you're displaced literally and figuratively in a new country that doesn't speak your language. You're living with relatives you probably hadn't seen in years, and it's just disruptive. And then even then, when her parents got there, they had to get acclimated to this culture that they weren't really a part of, and that takes decades.
Right. So that's right. So your mom came over, didn't speak any English when she came here.
Right.
Wow. Wow. As a young kid. Wow. That must have been
And
scary.
I mean, she was, that happened to so many
Right.
people. It's just, yeah.
Wow. Okay. So she comes over. Your dad came over with his family separately.
Mhm.
What were your parents' feelings or your feelings about, Castro and kind of how he ran the country? And is it sort of pride, but resentment, or neither, or both, or I don't know.
I think there was always a sense for me growing up of other, like, there's Cuban talk radio was always on. There was always this sense of displacement, like we're here because we couldn't be there anymore. And, it was never, there was not a lot of pro Castro discussion. It was very much like he displaced us and now we're here, not just from my parents, but from my grandparents and from the family. And it's like, it was not a positive picture. And there were a lot of, Cuban freedom groups and organizations like geared towards spreading that message too.
Have you ever been to Cuba yourself?
I haven't, no.
Wow. Wow. Now that, Castro's gone, would you consider going?
I'm not sure. It's still a communist country. There's still there's a lot of suffering going on there, and I'm not sure that's where I want to go.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So so you and your sister, when you were kids, you guys get along? Did not get along? You guys close, not close?
Yeah, we're fine.
Fine. So you're a kid, so you're you're in the Cuban community in Miami. So what kept you busy? What was your thing as a kid?
I mean, I grew up reading comics. I started as an Archie reader and then kind of shifted to Spider-Man and things like that, and the X-Men and Batman. I was a pretty bookish kid. Loved playing baseball in my backyard. Miami's, the great thing about Miami is the weather's always good unless it's raining. And when it's raining for 15 minutes and it stops raining.
Right.
And so a lot of time outside, just enjoying the outside and reading and stuff like that.
So were
TV, I was a big cartoon kid. So
oh, nice. So did you have at that time, did you have like like a circle of nerds that like you hung out with, or was that kind of like you were kind of like that was like your secret thing?
Oh no, it was not a secret thing. I mean, I remember, especially the summer before 6th grade, like the Marvel trading cards first came out, like those Fleer and Impel cards, and that was my gateway into superhero comics. I'd read a few before, like I'd read some X-Men and Spider-Man and the Hulk, but the trading cards were really what gave me a sense of the Marvel universe and like what characters were important. And then DC had similar cards too, so that was a good way to kind of get a crash course about these characters, and that's what really got me going into reading comics and kind of deciding which characters I wanted to follow. But my friends read comics too, and I still had friends that didn't. It wasn't like I was the kind of kid that really could shift from one group to the next and not really like,
Mhm.
I didn't like just align myself with one group of friends.
Okay. So you mentioned baseball. So I'm a baseball junkie
Oh,
myself.
good. Yeah, I love baseball.
I was gonna ask you because obviously, was the there's a lot of really talented players, from Cuba who, some have made it over, some didn't. Did that have any influence on you for your love of baseball, or was it just sort of that's just kind of what you did and that was your jam and you just had fun regardless?
I mean, I think baseball is a huge sport in Latin America and South America and the Caribbean. And so my dad is a huge baseball fan, but he was also a huge football fan. So I grew up a Dolphins fan. And when I was a young, we didn't have a baseball team. So
Right.
it's hard to believe there was a time there were no
Right.
Marlins. So I was a Red Sox fan. I mean,
Oh.
I just liked the Red Sox. I loved Roger Clemens. I thought he was a great pitcher. But then we got our own team and it was like, okay, see you later. Now we have the Marlins, even though it was weirdly, they were the Florida Marlins, even though they played in Miami. So now thankfully they're the Miami Marlins.
Well, we're going to have to be, we're mortal enemies because I am both a Yankee fan and a Jets fan.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I don't know what to tell you there. The Jets are, I have
uh,
very clear memories of going to Dolphins games as a kid and seeing as many Jets fans as Dolphins fans in the crowd.
Dan Marino haunted me in my sleep.
The spike play is legendary.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So I have to ask, so being from Miami, were you obligated to love Miami Vice?
I mean, I remember when it was on, and I think sometimes in retrospect, maybe my novels were a little bit of a response to it, that at least the Miami I remember was not like that. I think the Miami, it's obviously a fictionalized version of Miami, but
Sure.
I thought it was fine. It was one of those shows that was on. I think I was just too young for it.
Okay, fair enough. So you never went through the, you never had the white jacket with the pink and blue shirts and the shoes with no.
I've never been that cool. So, and I never will be. Yeah.
All right. So I have something else I wanted to ask. So
okay.
While the show was mostly filmed in other cities, Dexter was famously set in Miami. Was that fun for you at all?
I think what threw me off was that it was very clearly not filmed in Miami. It looks so much more like California. I'd read the original Dexter novels by Jeff Lindsay, which were a lot of fun.
Yep.
And they felt a little bit more connected to Miami, whereas on the show, which I still found entertaining, Michael C. Hall's a great actor. It's a good cast. It didn't feel as Miami to me, but it's a fun show.
Yeah. I mean, I've lived in the New York area my whole life, and it's obvious when shows are supposed to be in New York. And it's clear that they're filming in Toronto.
It's like Scarface is all about Miami. It's not shot in Miami.
All right. So as a kid, so you're into baseball. You read comics. You're into cartoons. So you tell me your favorite comics and your favorite cartoons.
I was a big Spider-Man kid. Like once I graduated from Archie was like the gateway, that's what got me into understanding comics and the humor of it. And, as a young kid, and then you want a little more action. So I graduated to Spider-Man and I was a big Spider-Man kid, and I would alternate between Spider-Man and the X-Men. In terms of cartoons, I watched the Disney Afternoon, which was great, like DuckTales and stuff like that. But I was really into Transformers mostly. That was my Transformers, G.I. Joe, Thundercats, Ninja Turtles was probably my last, like, as a kid cartoon. Like, you reach that age where you're almost a teenager and you stop watching cartoons. And probably Batman the Animated Series I was at the age where I was already aging out of cartoons, but still watching it because it was so good.
Oh, it's great. I mean, come on, you have to have little turtles on the half shell. I mean, come on.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, good. So talk to me. When did you first get the writing bug?
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to tell stories, and as a kid, I was such a reader. I read, I'd read a lot of nonfiction. Strangely enough, I read a lot of like presidential bios. I read a lot of history books as a young kid, and I ended up reading a lot true crime and crime fiction that I probably shouldn't have been reading so young. I read The Godfather when I was like 8 or 9. Mm-hmm. But I read a lot of comic books, and I would always think about, well, what would happen if this happened? And I was a good artist, and I would draw like my own comic books and I didn't realize then that what I was doing was writing. It just felt like I was just telling my own story. You're telling stories. And then as I got older in high school, that's when I kind of got into the idea of making them. And it didn't really feel like it could be a career though, until around college. And I started kind of really pecking away at my first novel, which is gone, is lost to the sands of time, and it's probably for the best. It was like a very mediocre Great Gatsby riff, but that, and then that kind of brought me back to realizing like I should write about things that I'm passionate about, like crime and Miami and superheroes and things that genre fiction is not bad. Genre fiction is, I hate their marketing terms, really. When you say this is this genre, you're really just saying where it should be shelved in the bookstore. It's not saying what it has to be.
So you and I both write in the mystery genre. So what appeals to you specifically about crime, mystery? Like what's the hook for you? Why do you go back to it?
I like this. I like crime fiction because it's the best way, I think, to spotlight the world, warts and all, while still telling a great story. You can show a city or a place or people at their worst or doing terrible things and kind of exploring the dark side of humanity, and at the same time injecting a little bit of hope. I love noir. I love seeing how people react in the worst circumstances and just seeing what they do when they're kind of painted into a corner. I think that's an interesting aspect of crime fiction. I love the private eye story. I love the idea of this kind of tainted knight trying to do good despite the system kind of oppressing them. And I think there's a lot we can learn about other places and other people and other cultures through crime fiction, through stories that explore those worlds. I wanted to write crime novels set in Miami, featuring a protagonist that had the same background as me, because I wasn't seeing that anywhere else.
Right. So actually, I wanted to ask you about that. So I remember, this is a weird side note. In my former life, I was a journalist.
Me too.
Really, what was your focus?
I did a lot of reporting as an intern for the Sentinel in South Florida. I was a copy editor. I did design. I did some online editing. I was a writer at Wizard Magazine, a writer and editor at Wizard Magazine, and did some freelance comic book journalism. And that's kind of what got me into PR.
Right. Well, we're gonna have to follow up on that too, because I actually do PR right now for real estate companies. But back then, I was actually a journalist for a pharmacy magazine of all things, which was weird because at the time I knew nothing about journalism and nothing about pharmacy. I just literally bullshitted my way into the job. I still don't know how I got it. But I was down in Florida for a pharmacy convention, and it was literally within days after, oh God, why am I having a blank? The designer who was killed on South
Versace,
who was killed. And obviously in South Beach, it's weird. It's like nightclub, mansion, nightclub. It's like a very strange kind of situation. And I was there when the police tape was right outside the house. I mean, he had just been killed like days before that. And it was just surreal. Was that a big story for being down there for you?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's always something going on. I mean, the whole Florida man trope is a little bit exaggerated, not exaggerated, but it's become this thing. But Miami was always a hotbed for that kind of like bizarre crime story. I mean, you have that. You also had like Arthur Thiel, who was this disgraced city commissioner who actually went into the Miami Herald building and committed suicide in the lobby of the building. It was just I mean, I don't want to say it was commonplace, but stuff like that happened. And it's, New York has its same kind of thing too, like just crazy crimes. And but I think Miami and South Florida have a particular quirkiness to it because it's seen as this paradise, but even paradise, there's a dark side to it. So
right. I mean, it's certainly many of our perceptions anyway of Miami and influence, like many things, are influenced by TV and movies and whatnot. So Miami has at least a reputation, or it had, of being sort of like the portway for the drug trade. Was that a really significant problem when you were down there?
I mean, the 80s were definitely, and they call it now the cocaine cowboys era, but it was definitely, Miami was the doorway to a lot of the drug trade. And there was a lot of crime. There was a lot of racial unrest. I think that was a really tumultuous period for the city. And, and then things cracked down and calmed down. But I think, there was some truth to that. And I think that's also a byproduct of Miami. Miami Vice is also a byproduct of that. But it's like with a much cooler sheen and, kind of boiled down for TV audiences, but there's a ton of great books just about that era and what went down.
Mm. So, I wanted to ask you. So, what did your folks do?
My mom is a bookkeeper, and my dad is a process server.
Oh, processing. Oh, that's it. Well, hold on. So, I want to talk to you about that for a second. So, you mentioned love of private eyes. Did your dad being a process server have any sort of influence on? Did you get a window into that world at all?
I mean, I'd been with him. I went with him on a few rides to serve papers, but that was maybe a slight influence. But it wasn't something where I was like, I'm going to make a character based off this experience. It was more that a few things from those experiences kind of trickled their way into the books, but it wasn't like a direct inspiration.
What did he think about that as a profession?
I think he enjoyed it. He's a people person. He likes talking to people. And I mean, what sucks is you're not always delivering good. You're usually not delivering good news if you're serving papers.
I would think not.
It's usually a citation or an eviction or something like that. So
did he ever have to, I mean, I don't know if he told you, but did he ever have to hunt people down to give them their papers? Were they ducking him? Did he have to use any
corporate? I mean, he wasn't a bounty hunter, so he was, but I think there were situations when he could tell somebody was dodging him and he'd have to be smart and kind of weave his way and find his way to do it. But he's good at his job. I mean, he's still doing it. So.
Wow. Okay. Groovy. All right. So, so you focus primarily on the mystery genre. Are you more interested in a sort of a twisty plot or focusing on character?
I think you get twisty plot by having character-based stories. I think you have to know who you're writing about and what their problems are and what their flaws are and what their desires are, and then you drop them into the setting and you kind of see where they go. For me, the novels that really resonate for me as a reader are the books that are about characters that are interesting and compelling and conflicted and have, baggage. You're kind of on this journey with the character. And as a writer, I'm more interested in the arc of the character. Like,
yep,
it starts like this, and this is how they end, and this is how they get there. And that will show me the way to the plot. And the plot has to serve the character, because if it feels interchangeable, if it feels like I could put any character into this plot and it'll just be the same book, then the plot is not working.
Agreed. All right. So you were a comic book fan as a kid, and you sort of transitioned, you got into, you were writing about comics, and then talk to me about how you kind of really got embedded in the comic book world.
Well, my first comic book job was when I worked at Wizard Magazine, which at the time was like the Entertainment Weekly of the comic book industry. It was like the big deal publication. It was a print magazine in the early 2000s and before that, and it covered all the big moments in comics like Image, Marvel, DC, and it was like basically the companies would come to Wizard and ask for coverage. Like being in Wizard was so helpful. It could actually make or break a title, which was interesting. And so I came in as an associate editor, and that was my first job in comics. So I went to my first comic book conventions. I met a lot of the talent working in comics at the time and made some lasting friendships. I'm still friends with a lot of the people I worked with there. And from there, I moved back to Miami and worked at the Miami Herald for a bit, and then moved back to New York to work at DC Comics. And that was my first in the industry job, where I was at a publishing house that made comics, but I was working in the publicity department. And so it was about promoting those books, and it was great. I mean, that was the doorway. That's what got me in the door.
So you wound up becoming, for quite a while, you were really embedded with Archie Comics.
Mm-hmm.
So Archie Comics today is not the Archie of old. So how did you get involved with Archie, and what's the distinction between sort of like old school Archie and new school?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up an Archie fan, so those were some of the first comics I read. And before I moved to New York to work at DC, I did some freelance work for Archie, doing some PR, and that was my first PR gig, even though it was part-time, just kind of learning pitching and placing stories and kind of promoting this brand that I really loved. And then after I was at DC for about 5 years and change, I went on to Archie, and I did publicity at Archie for a long time, with a brief return to DC for a couple of years. And then I stayed at Archie until very recently. So I think what, the big thing is the CEO, John Goldwater, basically when he came aboard, he said, I want Archie to feel relevant. I want Archie to feel like it's happening now, as opposed to being like this retro brand. And so that really opened the door to diversifying the cast, bringing in different tweaks, doing more fun things like Archie Kiss or Afterlife with Archie and things like that. And that really kind of snowballed after that. And then that's where it would open the door, I think, to stuff like Riverdale and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the show, and those kind of things.
So they kind of, maybe not quite so milquetoast the way it started.
Well, I mean, they still produce the classic Archie stuff. So I think what they very smartly did was diversified, and they have the more kind of YA, the more adult, and the more variety, I think. Because remember when I said, when I was a kid, you aged out of Archie. You read those stories and they were funny and entertaining, but then you kind of got the shtick and moved on to something else. But now the variety is so wide that there's just more stickiness to it, which is what you want.
So, all right, let's just shift a little bit. So, Star Wars as a franchise has made an interesting resurgence over the years. The most recent movie trilogy got mixed reactions from the fans, but it really seems to be booming on the small screen. But tell me about the Star Wars novel that you wrote and why you were compelled to focus on that particular character.
Well, I mean, they reached out to me and said, "Do you want to write a Poe Dameron novel?" So it wasn't like it wasn't a situation where I got to cherry pick the character, but I think this was before the last of the new trilogy, Rise of Skywalker, was coming, and they knew that the movie was going to set up a lot of things that pointed to Poe's past. Namely that he spent some time as a spice runner, that Zori Bliss was somehow tied to his past, and they wanted a YA novel that kind of synthesized all these elements and put it together into one really pivotal adventure in his early years. And so they reached out to me. I think around that time I had announced that my PI series, the Pete Fernandez books, were ending. And so it was a perfect segue into doing something completely different. And I grew up a Star Wars fan. Like, who isn't a Star Wars fan, really? I mean, it's like part of it's pop culture. It's our modern mythology. Everyone really knows Star Wars. It's the rarity is finding someone who isn't at least aware of it to some degree, So yeah, I worked with the story group, which is kind of like the group of people that kind of determine where the overall narrative is going to go and how the books work in with the movies and the TV shows. And it was a lot of fun. I had a blast. I went in not really, you never know, like when you're doing work for hire or IP work, you're never really sure how someone's going to be in terms of like managing the IP, but Star Wars was very open to new ideas and different voices. They didn't want every book to sound the same, basically.
So, but having not been, let's say, in the sci-fi novel world at that point, why did they come to you? How did that happen?
I mean, I've always been a sci-fi fan too. I guess I should have mentioned that when we did our download, but I mean, I was a Star Trek fan, a Star Wars fan as a kid. So I think they knew I knew the material, and I'd written enough comics, I think IP comics, work for hire comics, that they knew, okay, he can clearly write a novel. He can write a mystery kind of adventure novel, and can do stuff like Archie Meets Kiss and Archie Meets the Ramones, which are like playing in a certain sandbox and with different concepts. So yeah, I think that, I mean, I'm just presuming that was a logic.
Go back to that for a second. When I say to that, so you did Archie Meets Kiss and Archie Meets the Ramones. Like, how did that become a thing?
Well, each one was unique in its own way, but I think Archie Kiss is what kicked the door down. Gene Simmons reached out to the Archie CEO and said, we want to do a comic with Archie. Like, can you, just to kind of, to appeal to younger readers. And they agreed, and I kind of threw my hat in the ring to write it. I'd had a few Archie credits before and a short story credit at DC. And so they gave me the opportunity, which is great. And I wrote it. It did pretty well for them. And then that kind of set the stage for future stuff like Archie Meets the Ramones, which was different because you're dealing with an estate as opposed to, Archie Kiss, you're dealing with the actual people who are in the band, like Gene and Paul. And then we did Archie Meets B-52s, which was a little bit more like Kiss in that we were interacting with the band's management. And with the Archie's comic book, we had a different act in each issue. So we had more modern acts like Churches and Tegan and Sarah, and also more classic stuff like the Monkees and Blondie and things like that.
Wait, so hang on a second. So let's just go back for a second. So Gene Simmons of Kiss
Mhm.
right? Big tongue, right? The makeup, the whole bit. He
Yeah.
says, I want to do a comic book about Archie. But like, where did that come from?
I mean, Kiss has a history of comic books. They did their own comic at Marvel.
Right.
They did a bunch of comics at IDW. Like Dynamite is publishing their comics now. So I think Gene Simmons is a comic book fan, and I think
Right.
to him, having his characters or his persona interacting with an iconic brand like Archie was probably pretty cool.
So, did you at any point get to interact with Gene Simmons and Paul?
Yeah, it was neat. We did a signing. Dan Parent, who's the artist of Archie Kiss, and I did a signing at Golden Apple in LA with Gene and Paul, which was surreal. And we did an event in San Diego that year.
Hold on, don't skip back that. So you said it was surreal. How is it surreal?
I mean, it's just bizarre. Like you're literally, it was me and Dan, and Gene was standing next to me, and he would sign a book and say, "This is Alex. He's the writer." And I was just like, it was a kind of a bizarre, like, this is my life moment.
So what were the guys? What were they like?
They were fine, super nice, very professional. Like they showed up on time. They did what they had to do. They were very friendly and supportive. I think they were very nice, and they were also very easy to deal with in terms of approvals and stuff.
Did they talk about like life in Kiss at all when you were with them, or was it just kind of like, I'm just here to sign books?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really like shoot the breeze that much. We went in, we signed, we had a little small talk. Paul Stanley and I talked about, I mean, he grew up in Kew Gardens Hills, which is near Kew Gardens, and so we had a little bit of a Queens moment. But if, as you probably know, when you're at a signing, you're interacting with the fans, you're talking to the fans, and so obviously they were a draw, and the fans were. They wanted to make sure the fans had a good time engaging with them.
Yep, for sure. So what about, you said also the B-52s and Blondie and who else?
The Monkees, the Ramones.
Did you get a chance to interact with any of them as well, or did it?
No, I think at that point it was the Ramones. Sadly, the Ramones all the original Ramones had passed away by the time we did Archie Ramones. But we obviously partnered with their estates and the holding company that kind of manages their estates together. And so I'd like to think they would like it, but no, I didn't. I met Marky Ramone, who was the second drummer.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. All right. So Alex, so you got a new book coming out. I'm going to share my screen here, and then you're going to walk us through what you got here. So just bear with me a minute while I move some stuff around on my screen, and then we'll get your book up here. So I'm going to share the screen here, and I always do this wrong. So if I get it wrong, let me know. There we go. All right. Okay. So what are we looking at?
This is the cover to Secret Identity, which is my new novel from Flatiron Books. It's coming out in March of next year, and it is a comic book murder mystery set in New York, 1975. And it tells the story of Carmen Valdez, who's a Miami-born Cuban-American woman who moves to New York to kind of pursue her dream of writing comics. She gets a job at a kind of third-rate comic book publisher called Triumph Comics as the secretary to the EIC, the editor-in-chief, this guy named Jeffrey Carlisle, who's a comic book publisher with literary dreams, and she keeps pitching him stories, and he basically tells her at one point, look, it's just not going to happen. I have people lining up around my door, people that I want to keep busy with work, and I just can't give my secretary work. I don't have any assignments for you. So she feels, defeated. She's literally uprooted her life to work in comics. When a colleague, this editor at Triumph named Harvey Stern, approaches her and says, I have this opportunity to write a #1 issue, this new character. And I just haven't made her up yet. And I know you want to write, and I'd love for you to ghostwrite it with me. And she's hesitant at first. She's smart and realizes, there's something weird here, but he promises her, we'll figure out the credit, but I just can't deal with I can't get over this before we can write the script. And so I can't get this approved before we have to write the script. And so she does it. She ghostwrites the story. They write 6 scripts. And then she discovers that Harvey turned them all in under his name. But before she can say anything, Harvey's murdered. And she has to basically solve the murder of her friend and solve what happened to her IP, what happened to this character that has become a huge hit. And and at the same time, one cool thing about the book is that interspersed between, the prose narrative is there's actual comic book sequences drawn by Sandy Jarrell, who's a great, great, great comic book artist. He's done a ton of different things. He did a lot of Archie work. He's done things like Meteor Men, and he's just a versatile, really talented guy. And you can see his artwork there, that kind of comic booky sequence. That's his take on the character Carmen creates, called the legendary Lynx, who's a kind of cat themed crime fighter in Triumph City. And I had a blast writing it. It was really a way to blend two of my favorite things, crime fiction and comic books. And I'm really excited for people to read it. I hope they get a kick out of it.
Awesome. All right. So hang on. I'm going to X out of this for a second. Okay. Good stuff. So give me 1 second. All right. So that's great on the book. Can't wait to check that one out. But now it's time for a special segment of the show where we spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get. The categories are Silence of the Lambs, Stranger in a Strange Land, Play It Again Sam, Trick or Treat, The Dream Team, Kick Him in the Junk, and BB-8. You ready?
Sure.
All right, here we go, round and round. Let's see where she lands. All right, and what do we got for you? We got Stranger in a Strange Land. Okay, so you've spent your career mostly writing mystery, sci-fi, and comics. What's one genre you'd like to write that you have not dabbled in yet?
I would love to write a true crime book. I think that's something that, it would blend my journalism background and my kind of deadline driven writing. And it's so research intensive. Like something like Secret Identity took a ton of research. Before we hopped on, I showed you a stack of books. I had a stack of maybe 3 times as high of just books I read, just to research the time period and make sure I got everything right, and kind of wove this book through those hoops and created that sense of verisimilitude. But I think the challenge with true crime is you don't have the safety net of fiction. You have to be completely accurate. But that would be something that if I had enough runway and I had a story I was obsessed with and passionate about, I'd love to do that.
All right, very cool. All right, Alex. So you and I are both in the writing business. Let's go to our advice column. What's the best and worst writing advice someone ever gave you?
Best advice, and it's advice I give to new writers all the time, is if you want it to be a job, treat it like a job, which means put in the time, know when you're slacking, and don't over ceremonialize the process. And what I mean by that is don't make it too hard to get from standing up to sitting down and writing. And a lot of people do this. I did it as a young writer too. You have to have your computer in a certain place. You have to have music playing, the temperature a certain way. Your tea has to be so hot. And that's when you start writing. And there's always going to be a way to get distracted. For me, it's like I literally open up my laptop and the document I'm working on is open, or it's at least one click away. You have to make it as easy for yourself to write as possible.
All right. Very good. I agree.
In terms of the worst advice, I think the advice that I push back against is this idea that you have to write a certain amount of words each day. I think everybody has stuff. We have day jobs, we have children, we have responsibilities. I don't think you should beat yourself up if you don't write one day. I mean, as long as you're thinking about your work and you're pushing it along and kind of pushing the rock up the hill, then I think you're making progress. And I think thinking time is as valuable as writing time, and reading time is as valuable, because you need to be a reader before you're a writer. If you're not reading, you probably shouldn't be a writer. So.
Agreed. I go through this all the time, and I talk to other writers constantly about, to me, the thinking about it. I spend almost as much time thinking about what I'm going to write as I do the writing. So I really need to sort of like kick it around in my head, internalize it, so that it'll come out on the page. All right. So now we're going to discuss and find out if you have thick skin. As writers, when we put out our work and ourselves, criticism of all kind comes with it. The good, the bad, and everything in between. How do you feel about reviews? Do you take them to heart? Do you let them roll off you? Do some stick with you more than others?
I try to spend as much time on the good reviews as I do on the bad reviews, which is I read them, I engage, I think about them, and then I move on. I think it's as writers, when we get good reviews, our immediate response is, give me another one. It's like more, like I want another, endorphin rush of the positivity. And then with the bad reviews, we spend forever like dwelling over every word. And I think you have to find the balance. And, I'm not going to say I don't read reviews, because I do read them, but I also try to think about them for a moment and then just move on. Like, I'm doing the work, I'm doing the best I can. It's going to be what it's going to be. Once it's out of your hands and people are reading it, it's up to them. Like, that's the imaginary contract. You've created part of the story and they're taking it and interpreting it their way. But I also really strongly believe in getting feedback from people. So I have a good writers group. I have beta readers. I have a great editor. And, I also feel like if people I admire and trust like the work, then that's a good sign. And if I like it, if I've enjoyed writing it, and if I read it and think it's good, that's kind of the initial validation I need.
Right on. All right. So that was great. We have a few minutes, so we're going to take some questions from the audience. I've got
Awesome.
some in the queue already, and for folks at home, feel free to kick in a few more.
Yes.
Let's see there. So what do we got in here? All right. One question is your favorite books growing up, or 5 books that you think belong on everyone's bookshelf.
Favorite books growing up. As a kid in elementary school, I really loved Bridge to Terabithia. That was my first. It's a children's book, but it's not a picture book. It's a young reader's novel. And I don't remember a lot of the plot. I know the 2 kids would go to this kind of special world, and I just remember that one of the lead characters dies in the middle of the book. And it's not a spoiler. The book has been out for 40, 50 years. So if you haven't read it, I'm sorry, but it was so jarring to me as a reader because it was the first time I'd experienced character death, and how people react to it, and just the weight of that moment. And it has had a huge impact on my own fiction eventually. The Godfather, like I mentioned, was a huge book to me, just because it showed me the value of like a plot twist. If you start, the book itself is so different from the movie. The movie is kind of this, royal, mob royalty, and it's so, highbrow, and it's great. I love the movie, but the book itself is so much pulpier and grittier and nastier. And I probably should not have been reading it as young as I was, but I did, and I think it worked out fine. But the book also sets it up as if Sonny is going to be the protagonist of the whole novel, and then when he goes through that toll booth and gets shot up, it shifts your whole perception of the book. And that really taught me the value of keeping your readers off balance and pulling the rug out from under them every once in a while. And if you read the Pete series, that I'm fond of that kind of surprise. In the last Pete book, a long-time supporting character meets their end at an unexpected moment, and it's I feel like that's what that's how life is. There are unexpected moments that happen, and it pulls you out of your reverie, I guess. I'm trying to think of other books, that are important. I just think people need to read what they're passionate about. I think that, having reading lists or things that you have to read, reading shouldn't be homework unless it is actual homework in school. Like, read what you find pleasurable. I'm not a proponent of the guilty pleasures idea. I think if you read it and you like it, it's good. So.
All right. So another one, favorite Star Wars movies or moments?
Favorite Star Wars movies. I'm a sucker for Empire Strikes Back. I love the dark sequel. I love when the heroes, and then this is just speaking generally, when heroes are pushed to their limits and kind of cornered and unable. And I love dark endings sometimes. I think that's what sets up the more beloved, like, third chapters, like Return of the Jedi, and celebratory moments like that. So it's even, like Godfather 2 is a really dark second act to the trilogy. And so, I like Empire. I really like I like the original trilogy. I like The Force Awakens. I watched the prequels. I enjoy them. I think they're fine.
All right. So, all right. What else we got here? Let's see. We talked about Poe. All right. So that's what we got here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen one more time, and then hang on. What do we got here? Bear with me. I'm going to share. And here we go, and boom, share, and we're back on Secret Identity. Okay, so we talked about Secret Identity. What's coming next for you? What else you got going on?
I've got some comic book stuff can't announce yet. It's still pending. I'm doing a short story in this Marvel anthology called Marvel Voices Comunidades, which is a Latinx pride book with a lot of great creators. And so I've got a short story in that. I've also got a short story in an upcoming issue of Lazarus, which is a creator-owned comic by Greg Rucka and Michael Lark that comes out from Image Comics, and I'm excited about that. And just getting the chance to play in these worlds is really neat. And I've got some other stuff that's coming down the pipe. We also Dark Horse just released the first collection of the Black Ghost, which was the superhero noir I did for Comixology Originals with Monica Gallagher and George Cambadeas.
All right, awesome, Alex. That sounds great. We've been talking about crime fiction and a little sci-fi. So if you folks are up for a little Blade Runner style sci-fi with your crime and mystery, I'll encourage you to check out my sci-fi noir Crackle and Fire, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye, Angela Hardwick, who is part Doctor Who, part Blade Runner, and part Philip Marlowe. And I am thrilled to announce the second book in the series, Fractured Lives, will be out in print in September via Crazy 8 Press and is available now in ebook on pre-order.
Congrats.
And thank you. In this adventure, Hardwick is hired to investigate a galaxy design prodigy undergoing what appears to be a nervous breakdown, but may in fact be linked to an urban legend known as the Scarlet Raj, who may or may not be initiating a play to amass power throughout the realm. All right, so that's what we got for me. Thanks again, Alex, for coming on the show. And I want to thank everyone who's watching at home. This was a great hour. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro, and this was my last show of the season, but have no fear. I will be back with an all-star lineup of great authors starting September 22nd and running through December. Have a great summer, everyone, and I'll see you all next season. Take care.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks a lot. It was great to have you.
Yeah, it was good.
All right. Thanks a lot, folks. Take care now.